An upscale restaurant in the city bustles with activity, filled with the sounds of quiet conversation, clinking dishes, and the soft hum of classical music. Mrs. Evelyn Jackson, a well-dressed, elderly black woman, steps inside, carrying herself with grace. She's been to this restaurant numerous times before, but today, a new face greets her. The young waiter, Robert Miller, barely glances her way as she approaches the hostess stand, his attention on the affluent white couple he's seating. Mrs. Jackson clears her throat politely, but Robert still doesn't look up immediately. When he finally does, there's a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. His smile is faint, forced, and when she asks for a table by the window, his expression shifts, as if calculating whether she belongs here or not. "We're fully booked, ma'am," he says, his voice indifferent. The words are mechanical, dismissive. His eyes quickly scan her outfit, a tailored coat and a simple pearl necklace, but he doesn't seem to process the dignity she exudes. Instead, his thoughts are clouded by an assumption: she doesn't belong in a place like this. Mrs. Jackson, remaining calm, replies, "I made a reservation under the name Jackson." There's no anger in her voice, just quiet confidence, as if she's used to this kind of treatment but chooses not to engage with it emotionally. Robert furrows his brow and flips through the reservation book with disinterest, not actually searching for her name. After a few moments, he looks up, the faint smirk on his face betraying his belief that she's lying. "I don't see any reservation here," he says, already moving on to the next task, as if she no longer exists. Her composure remains intact. "Perhaps you should check again. I was invited by my son. He asked me to meet him here." This mention of her son makes Robert pause, but only for a moment. He's convinced she's bluffing. A flicker of impatience crosses his face. "Ma'am, I'm telling you, there's no table available. You'll need to try somewhere else." Mrs. Jackson looks around the dining area, where a few empty tables sit unused. Her eyes land on the window seat she always requests, and she glances back at Robert, whose irritation is now apparent. There's no point in pushing further, she knows what this is. The slight tremor of hurt ripples beneath her calm exterior, but she won't let him see it. Instead, she decides to wait. As she stands there, a few of the other patrons cast subtle glances in her direction. They sense the awkwardness but remain silent, unwilling to intervene. This is how these moments unfold, quietly, politely, with just enough deniability to make those who witness it feel they don't need to act. Minutes pass, and still, no one seats her. Robert has moved on, attending to other guests, his tone cheerful and welcoming for the white patrons who have just walked in. The contrast is stark, and Mrs. Jackson notices, but she stands still, her patience unwavering. It's not the first time she's experienced something like this. The assumptions, the subtle indignities, they've been a constant presence throughout her life. But Mrs. Jackson learned long ago that her strength lies in her ability to remain composed, to navigate these moments with grace. Meanwhile, Robert, now busy tending to another table, avoids making eye contact with her. He's already decided that she's not worth his time. In his mind, he's done his job, he's upheld the restaurant's standards by keeping the wrong kind of guests from taking a seat. As the minutes tick by, the restaurant's head manager, David Williams, walks past the entrance. He notices Mrs. Jackson standing there but doesn't recognize the full situation immediately. After all, he's seen her here before, but today, with a busy crowd and a new staff, the moment slips by him unnoticed. Mrs. Jackson remains patient, but there's a heaviness now. She's used to this, yes, but it doesn't mean it hurts any less each time it happens. She considers leaving, but then decides against it. She's not going to let this moment define her or the way she chooses to move through the world. The clock keeps ticking. Other guests have come and gone, seated quickly and with smiles, while she's still standing, waiting for acknowledgement that she knows she deserves but hasn't received. This is the reality she's faced for decades, an unspoken, yet ever-present reminder that she's often seen as less, even when she's more. And then, in the midst of it all, James Jackson, her son, steps out from the kitchen. His sharp eyes immediately take in the scene, his mother, standing at the entrance, not seated, while his staff bustles around, seemingly oblivious. His jaw tightens. Without hesitation, he strides toward his mother. She sees him and offers a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of the situation. He knows exactly what's happened, and as he approaches, his expression darkens, not with anger, but with disappointment. "Mom," James says softly, as he reaches her. He glances at the empty table by the window and then back at Robert, who is still tending to another guest, unaware of the storm about to come his way. James leans in and whispers to his mother, "Why haven't you been seated?" She simply nods toward Robert, and in that single gesture, James understands everything. James, after exchanging a glance with his mother, approaches Robert. His steps are firm, his expression unreadable. When he reaches the young waiter, he waits for a moment, just long enough for Robert to realize someone is standing behind him. Robert turns, and when he sees James, there's a flicker of recognition, the man who runs things behind the scenes, who the staff know is serious but approachable. Yet Robert doesn't fully grasp what's about to unfold. Without raising his voice, James asks, "Why hasn't this lady been seated yet?" The directness of the question catches Robert off guard. He stammers, trying to come up with a response that doesn't make him seem at fault. "Oh, sir, we're fully booked. I explained that to her," Robert replies, his tone still carrying the casual indifference he'd used earlier. He tries to sound professional, but there's a defensive edge now that he senses James might not be satisfied with the answer. James doesn't immediately respond. Instead, he lets Robert's words hang in the air for a moment, as if allowing him time to reconsider. But Robert stands by his explanation, still unaware of the gravity of his actions. In his mind, he's just following protocol. He doesn't see that his decision was influenced by assumptions he had no right to make. "There's an open table by the window," James says, his voice measured but with a hard undertone. "Why wasn't she seated there?" Robert falters, his eyes darting toward the window seat, then back to James. He struggles to find an excuse, but there's none that fits. The weight of the situation starts to dawn on him, but he's not yet fully aware of how deeply he's misjudged everything. "Well, I didn't think I wasn't sure if—" Robert trails off, realizing his mistake, but unable to articulate it. His discomfort grows as the silence stretches between them. Other staff members nearby notice the tension and begin watching, though none of them intervene. James takes a step closer, his voice dropping but becoming more intense. "You didn't think she what?" Robert's throat tightens. He knows what he wants to say, but saying it out loud would expose his bias in the clearest terms possible. He swallows hard, feeling the weight of James's question. At this moment, James doesn't need Robert to spell it out. He already knows. He's seen this behavior countless times before, and while it never stops stinging, it's never surprising. But this time, it's personal. His own mother, dismissed and disrespected in his own establishment. James finally speaks again, but his tone has shifted, now filled with controlled disappointment. "This is my mother. The woman you just turned away without even considering if she had a reservation." Robert's eyes widen as the realization hits him with full force. His face drains of color, and his mouth opens, but no words come out. The room seems to shrink around him as the implications of what he's done settle in. The woman he casually dismissed wasn't just another guest. She was the mother of the man who owns this very restaurant. I didn't know," Robert stutters, trying to backtrack, but it's too late. The damage is done. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," James replies, still calm, but there's a sharpness now, each word landing with precision. "You didn't ask. You assumed. And that's the problem." The statement hangs in the air, heavy with truth. Robert is left speechless, unable to defend his actions. He realizes that he'd made assumptions based on Mrs. Jackson's appearance, her age, her race, her quiet demeanor, and that those assumptions led him to treat her differently. He feels exposed, not just in front of James, but in front of the other staff and guests who are now aware of the unfolding confrontation. James doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His presence and the quiet authority in his words are enough to cut through the room. This restaurant prides itself on treating every guest with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. That's how we've built our reputation. If you can't do that, you don't belong here. Robert's heart races. The realization that his job could be at stake floods his mind. But beyond that, there's a deeper shame growing inside him, the realization that his behavior reflects a broader issue, one that extends beyond this single interaction. He hadn't seen Mrs. Jackson as deserving of the same respect as the other guests. And now, faced with the consequences of that, he feels the weight of his prejudice. I'm really sorry, sir, Robert says quietly, though he knows it's not enough. I didn't mean to offend her. James doesn't immediately respond. He studies Robert for a moment, letting the young man's apology sit. But apologies, he knows, are often reflexive, words spoken out of fear of punishment, not necessarily out of understanding. He's heard plenty of them before, and they rarely address the core issue. This isn't just about an apology, James says, his voice still controlled. This is about understanding why you thought it was okay to treat her differently in the first place. You need to think about that. Robert nods, though he knows there's little he can say to redeem himself in this moment. His mind races as he tries to figure out how to prove that he's truly sorry, that he can learn from this. James takes a breath, softening slightly as he shifts his focus back to the bigger picture. People make mistakes. We all do. But if you want to stay here, you need to learn from this. Understand what you did, and why it's not acceptable. And then you need to change. Robert nods again, this time more sincerely. He knows he has a lot of work to do, not just to keep his job, but to address the biases that have been lurking beneath the surface, influencing his actions without him even realizing it. James doesn't linger on the moment any longer. He turns to his mother, offering her his arm. Let's get you seated, Mom. Mrs. Jackson takes his arm, and together they walk toward the window seat, leaving Robert standing there, a mix of shame, regret, and contemplation swirling in his chest. He watches as James and Mrs. Jackson sit down, the scene a quiet reminder of the lessons he still has to learn. James helps his mother settle into her chair, and as he does, he glances back toward the staff. A quiet intensity lingers in the air, the kind that comes when a moment has shifted from uncomfortable to illuminating. Every worker in the restaurant, every guest who had turned a blind eye to what just transpired, now feels the weight of the silence. But James doesn't intend to let this moment pass without making it a lesson for all. The shift from discomfort to understanding is necessary, but only if it leads to change. With his mother seated, James stands tall, addressing not just Robert but the entire staff. We talk a lot about service here, he begins, his voice carrying through the room with calm authority. About making people feel welcome, about creating a space where anyone can come and enjoy a meal. But what does that mean when we only offer that kind of service to certain people? His words hit the room like a slow wave, washing over the staff and the diners alike. Some of the servers exchange nervous glances, while others lower their gazes, uncomfortable with the truth being laid out so plainly. But James continues, determined to make sure this lesson is learned. We've built this restaurant on the idea that everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect. No exceptions. No assumptions. But today, I watched as my mother, someone who should have been treated with the utmost respect, was dismissed simply because of how she looks. And I know this isn't the first time something like this has happened. He doesn't need to raise his voice to make an impact. The words themselves carry enough power. Every person listening can feel the importance of what's being said. Even the guests, some of whom had silently watched the earlier exchange, now realize they too played a part by choosing not to intervene. Robert, standing awkwardly off to the side, feels the full weight of James's words. He wants to apologize again, to find a way to make it right, but something inside him knows that this moment is not about his apology. It's about something bigger. It's about recognizing the pattern of behavior that led to this moment, and understanding that this isn't just about a single mistake but a mindset that needs to be challenged and changed. James steps toward the middle of the dining area, ensuring everyone can hear him clearly. Racism doesn't always come with a loud voice or angry words. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it shows up in a look, in an assumption, in the way someone's ignored or dismissed. It's the little things that build up over time until someone's dignity is chipped away piece by piece. The room is completely still, every eye now focused on James. Even the diners, some of whom were initially uncomfortable with the unfolding situation, can't look away. They're witnessing a moment of accountability, something that feels rare and powerful. James continues, his voice unwavering. The thing about bias is that it's not always something people do on purpose. It's something that creeps into our minds, something we don't always recognize until it's too late. But that doesn't make it any less damaging. He glances back at Robert, making it clear that this is a lesson for him, but also for everyone. What happened here today wasn't just about my mother. It was about a mindset that needs to be changed. And it's not just Robert's mindset, it's something we all need to think about. How many times have we made assumptions about someone because of the way they look? How many times have we dismissed someone without giving them a chance? Robert shifts uncomfortably, feeling the weight of the moment settle deeper into his chest. He knows James is right, and though he wishes he could go back and undo his actions, he also understands that the best he can do now is learn from this and change. James pauses for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a calm but firm resolve, he adds, "We're better than this. I know we are. That's why we're having this conversation. Because if we want to call ourselves a place that truly welcomes everyone, then we need to act like it. Every day. With every person who walks through those doors." There's a murmur among the staff, a collective acknowledgement that something important has just been said. The air in the restaurant feels different now, heavier, but also more aware. The veil of politeness that often hides these issues has been pulled back, and now, the truth is staring everyone in the face. Mrs. Jackson, sitting quietly at her table, watches her son with a sense of pride. She's seen these moments play out many times in her life, but this one feels different. This one feels like it could actually lead to something better. She knows James isn't just speaking for her. He's speaking for every person who's ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin, their age, or any other characteristic that someone might use to judge them unfairly. James takes one last look around the room before speaking his final words. This is the kind of place I want to run. A place where everyone is seen for who they are, not what someone assumes about them. If you can't be a part of that, if you can't learn from moments like this, then you don't belong here. The message is clear. James isn't just talking about one incident. He's talking about the culture of the restaurant, and by extension, the culture of the world outside these walls. It's a call for change, a demand for reflection and growth. Robert finally speaks, his voice quiet but steady. I'll do better. I understand now. I didn't see it before, but I do now. It's not much, but it's honest, and James can see that there's real intent behind the words. It's a start. James nods, offering a small but meaningful acknowledgement of Robert's words. Good. That's all I ask. Now let's move forward. With that, the moment begins to pass, but its impact lingers. The staff go back to their tasks, but there's a different energy in the room now. An understanding has been reached, and though there's still work to be done, it feels like a step in the right direction. Mrs. Jackson, still sitting by the window, smiles softly. The sun streams through the glass, casting a warm light over her table. She picks up the menu, ready to enjoy the meal she came here for, knowing that today's events have sparked something much larger than just a dining experience. The tension in the air starts to dissolve, replaced by a quiet but palpable sense of reflection. The restaurant slowly returns to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere feels altered, more aware, as if everyone present understands that they've just witnessed something important. James walks back to his mother's table, the weight of what has just transpired settling on his shoulders, but he remains steady. He pulls out the chair next to her, sitting down quietly, his gaze drifting across the room. The lesson has been taught, but now comes the part where change must follow through action. Mrs. Jackson doesn't say much at first. She doesn't need to. She's seen moments like these many times in her life, moments where the ugliness of prejudice is laid bare, then followed by an apology, or an explanation. Yet, this time, it feels different. Her son has grown into a man who isn't just a witness to these injustices but someone who actively fights against them, not with loud gestures but with the power of his presence and his words. As they sit, Robert, still shaken but trying to regain his composure, approaches the table cautiously. There's no arrogance left in him, no defensive posture. He stands quietly for a moment, unsure of how to proceed, but knowing he needs to speak. Mrs. Jackson looks up, her expression calm yet knowing. She's seen this before, the moment of reckoning that comes when someone realizes the impact of their bias. But what happens next is always what matters most. "I'm really sorry for how I treated you earlier," Robert says, his voice low but steady. I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome. I understand now that I was wrong." There's sincerity in his tone, the kind that only comes from having faced the hard truth about oneself. Mrs. Jackson listens, and for a moment she says nothing, allowing the young man to sit with the weight of his words. Then, with a gentle nod, she speaks. "Thank you for your apology," she says softly, but firmly. "It's important that you recognize what happened, not just for me, but for yourself. These moments teach us things, if we let them." Robert nods, visibly relieved that she's not rejecting his apology outright, but he also knows that this isn't just about saying the right words. It's about carrying the lesson forward. "I will do better," he adds, and this time, there's a weight to his promise, as though he truly intends to make good on it. Mrs. Jackson offers him a small, kind smile. "That's all anyone can ask for," she replies, her voice full of quiet wisdom. "We're all learning every day." With that, Robert steps back, giving a final nod to James before turning to return to his duties. It's a small moment, but a meaningful one. He knows his actions today won't be forgotten, but he also knows that this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a journey to unlearn the prejudices he hadn't even realized were there. James watches him go, a thoughtful look on his face. "You handled that well," he says to his mother, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Mrs. Jackson chuckles softly, shaking her head. "I've had a lifetime of practice, son," she replies, her voice light but tinged with the weight of her experiences. "But it never gets easier. Every time it happens, it still stings." James nods, understanding all too well what she means. He's felt the sting himself, countless times, in different ways. "I know," he says quietly. "But today, we made sure it won't go unnoticed. That's the part that matters." They sit in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on what's just unfolded. For Mrs. Jackson, it's a moment of quiet pride, seeing how far her son has come, not just in his career, but in the way he handles these difficult situations with such grace and authority. For James, it's a reminder of the responsibility he carries, not just as a business owner, but as a black man in a position of leadership. He knows that today's events are just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a lifelong journey toward making the world a more just and equal place. After a while, their food arrives, and the conversation shifts to lighter topics, the kind that fill the gaps after a heavy moment has passed. They talk about family, old memories, and future plans, the comfort of normalcy wrapping around them like a warm blanket. But even as the meal progresses, the lesson from earlier lingers in the background. The staff moves more carefully now, their interactions with the guests noticeably more attentive, more thoughtful. The shift is subtle, but it's there, a newfound awareness that wasn't present before. The patrons, too, seem more engaged, less absorbed in their own bubbles. It's as though the entire restaurant has collectively paused to think about the world beyond their own experiences, even if only for a brief moment. As the meal comes to a close, James calls over David Williams, the head manager, who's been quietly observing the day's events from the sidelines. David, a seasoned professional, has always prided himself on running a tight ship, but even he knows that today, something slipped through the cracks. He approaches the table with a serious expression, ready to address the issue head-on. "I want to apologize, Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Jackson," David says, his tone respectful. This shouldn't have happened. We train our staff to treat everyone with respect, and today, we failed to uphold that standard. James waves off the formality, not wanting to dwell on the mistake any longer than necessary. We've dealt with it, he says simply. What matters now is that we learn from it. I know you run a good team here, David. Let's just make sure this is the last time something like this happens. David nods, taking the words to heart. Absolutely, he replies. We'll be better. I'll make sure of it. With that, the conversation ends on a note of mutual understanding. The incident is behind them now, but the lessons it brought forward will stay with everyone involved, shaping the way they move forward from here. As James and Mrs. Jackson prepare to leave, the restaurant feels different. There's no grand gesture, no overt acknowledgement of what's changed, but something undeniably has. The air feels lighter, more open, as though the walls themselves have absorbed the day's message. James offers his mother his arm once more, and together, they walk toward the door, their heads held high. There's no need for further words. They've said what needed to be said, and now, it's time to let the world catch up. As they step outside into the bright afternoon sun, the moment fades into the background, but its impact remains. What happened inside was more than just a confrontation. It was a step towards something better, a small but meaningful push toward a future where moments like these become less and less frequent, until, one day, they don't happen at all.